The air smelled like snow. Claire Moore stood on the sidewalk outside the hardware store on West 11th Street, clutching a folded quilt like it was a lifeline. The sky was low and gray, the kind of sky that couldn't decide whether to spit snow or sleet. Her breath fogged in the air, slow and even, though her heart wasn't. She scanned the edge of the storefront, the alley beside it, the narrow patch of brick where the man always sat. He wasn't there. The upside-down plastic bucket, the one that had served as his seat for 6 winters, was missing. No ragged backpack, no rolled sleeping mat, no man. Claire took a few steps forward, boots crunching over blackened slush. A flicker of unease stirred in her chest. Not panic. Not yet. But a dull kind of ache, like something had shifted off center in a world she thought she understood. Every year, he showed up when the frost did, around mid-November. When the wind got mean and the light died early, the man would appear, always alone, always silent, hunched on that plastic bucket like he was waiting for something only he could see. He never asked for anything, never held a cardboard sign, never made eye contact with strangers, just sat, watching people pass with that unreadable look, a face carved out of stone and shadow. She never knew his name, never tried to. At first, Claire had just walked past like everyone else, pretending she didn't see him. But something about the way he sat, still as a statue, worn thin by the world, stuck with her. It made her feel guilty, and then angry at herself for feeling guilty. She remembered the first time she stopped, the first time she handed him something, a quilt. Not just any quilt. It was the first one she had made after Ethan died. Her son, 19 years old, barely a man, lost in a war that had no clear enemy and no clear end. Grief had turned her into a ghost, but sewing patching together old shirts, worn jeans, scraps of his childhood bed sheets that gave her hands something to do when her heart couldn't take the silence. That quilt, her first act of creation in the ruins of her life, ended up in the hands of a stranger with nothing. She'd half expected him to reject it, or to scoff. Instead, he had nodded once, not a thank you, just a nod, like he understood exactly what it was she was giving him. And maybe he did. From then on, it became a ritual. Each winter, she made him a new one. Always hand-stitched, always from her growing pile of worn, familiar fabric. She told herself it was just a way to help someone in need. But it was more than that. Giving him that quilt, watching his hands shake as he took it, watching him wrap it around himself without saying a word, made her feel like Ethan's memory was alive in some quiet, dignified way. But now, the man was gone. Claire walked down the alley beside the store, peering into the shadows. The wind pushed at her coat, slicing through the gaps in the fabric like knives. Her fingers tightened around the quilt, still warm from her car's heater. She knocked gently on the back door of the store, but no one answered. The snow began to fall sparse, dry flakes that danced in circles before landing. She stood there for a minute, unsure what she was waiting for. Then, slowly, she turned and walked back to her car. As she pulled open the door, her eyes caught something on the ground beside the curb, a small patch of thread caught on a broken bit of concrete. She crouched, brushed the snow aside, and picked it up, a tiny square of plaid flannel, blue and gray, her fabric. From last year's quilt, it was ripped, frayed, like it had been torn during a struggle or accident. Her stomach sank. Something was wrong. Not the usual wrong, the kind you get used to when you've lost a child and the world keeps spinning like nothing happened, but a new kind of wrong, one that itched under the skin. She drove home with the heater blasting and the quilt beside her, folded like a question mark. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the living room window, a cup of cold tea in her hands, watching the snow pile up along the railing. Her house was too quiet, the silence thick as wool. She hadn't planned to care this much. He was just a man on the street, just someone she barely knew. But as the hours passed and the storm thickened, she found herself replaying every winter encounter in her mind. He never looked her in the eye, but he always nodded, always took the quilt with both hands, gently, like it was something sacred. Who was he? The next morning, Claire drove back. Still no sign. The bucket hadn't returned. She asked the woman at the cafe down the street, an older woman with a memory like a steel trap. Him. Haven't seen him since just after Thanksgiving, she said, frowning. Real quiet. That one. You used to bring him soup or something. Write quilts, Claire replied, barely above a whisper. The woman nodded slowly. Well, he just stopped showing up one day. Figured he moved on, or she didn't finish the sentence. Claire thanked her and left, but the pit in her stomach deepened. She tried the shelters next. The big one by the rail yard didn't know him. The smaller one by the church recognized her description. Yeah, he stayed here a few nights last year. Didn't talk much. Real polite. Left early. This year haven't seen him. Another volunteer chimed in. Said he had somewhere to be. Something about a grave. Claire froze. What grave, she asked. Voice sharp. The volunteer shrugged. Didn't say, just that he had to go visit someone. Kept mentioning a name. Ethan. I think. The world tilted. Claire left without saying goodbye, her hands trembling as she gripped the steering wheel. The quilt sat on the passenger seat beside her, untouched. She drove toward the cemetery, toward her son. The cemetery loomed at the edge of town like a secret everyone agreed not to talk about. Wind howled through bare trees as Claire pulled up to the rusted iron gates, headlights casting long shadows over the snow-covered stones. The place always looked like a painting in winter quiet, still too beautiful to hold the amount of sorrow it did. She drove the familiar gravel path, her tires crunching softly, until she reached the back row. Section E, row 14, third stone from the end. Ethan Daniel Moore, 2003-2018. He lived with courage. He left with honor. Claire sat in the car for a long moment, staring at the headstone. It was clean, clear of snow, just like the path leading to it. She hadn't been here in over a month, and the last snowfall had come heavy 4 days ago. Someone had been here recently. She stepped out, pulling her coat tighter around her, and walked slowly to the grave. Her boots crunched over a fresh set of footprints, large, deliberate, paced. They led directly to Ethan's grave, and nowhere else. No wreath, no flowers. But something sat at the base of the headstone, a used matchbook, a burnt-down candle, long frozen into the soil. And tucked beneath the grass was something that stopped her heart, a tiny, tarnished military pin, infantry cross rifles. Claire knelt down, brushed the snow gently away from the grave, and picked up the pin. It was heavy, old, worn by time and by use. Her mind reeled. He'd said a grave. He'd said the name Ethan. It couldn't be a coincidence. She looked around the cemetery, half expecting to see him in the shadows, hidden behind one of the trees. But there was no movement, just wind slicing through the branches and the faint hum of the town far in the distance. Tears prickled at her eyes. She placed the quilt on the ground beside the grave and sat, hands tucked beneath her knees for warmth. For the first time in years, she spoke to her son aloud. I think someone's been watching over you. The next morning, Claire woke with frost still in her lungs and a mind full of questions. Her coffee went cold untouched. She stared at the military pin resting on her kitchen table, turning it over in her fingers like it might suddenly speak. Who was he? Why Ethan's grave? How long had he been going there? She called the cemetery office just after they opened. The woman who answered recognized Claire's voice instantly. Ms. Moore. Of course. I'm so sorry. the woman began. But Claire cut her off gently. "I'm not calling about the stone," she said. "I need to know something. Has anyone else been visiting my son's grave in the last few months?" A pause. "Well, we don't keep official records of that, ma'am. But our groundskeeper, Joe, he might know. He's out there every morning around 6. Claire didn't wait. 20 minutes later, she was standing in Joe's shed, the warmth of his kerosene heater barely cutting through the bitter morning cold. "Yeah," Joe said, wiping grease from his hands. "I know the guy. Shows up before dawn. Doesn't say much. Just sits there for a while, then leaves. Usually picks up trash on his way out. Never asks for anything. Thought maybe he was a vet." Claire showed him the pin. Joe nodded. That, his "found it" by Ethan's headstone. Joe let out a low whistle. "Then yeah. Bet he left it on purpose." Claire drove back through town, her mind racing. She stopped at the diner on 9th where the old veterans used to gather. Her husband, before he passed, had taken Ethan there every Saturday after soccer practice. A few of the regulars were still there, white hair, heavy jackets, coffee cups steaming between gnarled fingers. She approached a man named Gil, Korean War, if she remembered right. Had a son in Vietnam, a grandson in Iraq. "Did any of you ever see a guy, kind of rough-looking, gray beard, quiet, might be a vet, homeless maybe, stayed around West 11th. They all shook their heads except for Gil. "Think I know who you mean," he said. "Big guy. Always sat near the hardware store. Wore the same faded green coat. Never said a word to me. But he nodded once when I saluted him." "Do you know his name?" Claire asked, nearly breathless. Gil shook his head. "No, ma'am. But I think he's Army." Carried himself like someone who's seen things. That evening, Claire sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by photos of Ethan. His military portrait, the last photo he ever sent her, was framed on the windowsill. She stared at it, searching. His eyes were young, but there was weight in them, burden, resolve. He saved someone, she thought. She opened her laptop and searched his unit records. It wasn't easy, so much had been classified or buried in red tape, but she found an article buried deep in a veteran's message board, a short post, written anonymously, about a young soldier named Moore who died pulling a wounded squad mate from a wrecked Humvee under fire. It didn't name the man he saved, but it was enough. Someone owed Ethan their life. She leaned back in her chair, heart hammering. And that someone had been sitting on a bucket outside the hardware store every winter. Claire returned to the cemetery just after dark. The town had settled into its winter-quiet streetlights flickering on with no fanfare, shop signs dimming, and the occasional echo of tires slicing through slush. But the cemetery, as always, felt like another world entirely. Still, sacred, untouched. She parked outside the gate and killed the engine. Snow had started to fall again, fat, slow flakes drifting sideways in the breeze. She left the heater running for a minute, hesitant, unsure. What exactly was she hoping to see? The man, a ghost proof. She wasn't going mad. Then she spotted movement. A dark figure climbed silently over the stone wall on the west side of the cemetery. Not through the gate, over the wall. As if he wasn't supposed to be here. As if he didn't want anyone to know he came. He moved with surprising agility, boots barely leaving a trace in the snow. Claire ducked instinctively behind her windshield as he passed within 20 feet of her car. Same long coat. Same slow, deliberate gait. She hadn't seen that coat in nearly a year, but the moment she did, she knew it was him. He made his way across the rows of headstones with practiced ease, like someone who had walked this same path 100 times. No hesitation, no uncertainty. Every step was purposeful. He stopped at Ethan's grave. Claire stepped out of the car. The cold hit her like a slap sharp. sudden, biting through her coat and gloves. She moved cautiously, her boots muffled by the snow, heart thudding harder with each step. The man knelt by the headstone. From a distance, she saw him remove his gloves and rest a bare hand on the marble. His lips moved slightly, not loud enough to hear, but unmistakable. He was speaking. To Ethan. Claire swallowed. She took another step forward. "You knew him," she said. Her voice was calm but steady, slicing through the stillness like a blade. The man froze, his head turned slightly, but he didn't rise. "You shouldn't be out here," he said. "But you should," she asked. Silence. She took another few steps. Closer now. The wind had died, leaving the world suspended in an eerie hush. He stood slowly. Claire saw the deep creases in his face, the ragged beard, the eyes that looked like they'd forgotten what softness felt like. But there was no fear in him. Just weight. A kind of gravity she couldn't quite describe. "You've been coming here," she said. "I found your pin." He looked at her then. Really looked. "You're his mother," he said softly. Her breath caught in her throat. "Yes." He nodded. "Once." Claire stepped closer. "How long since I found out?" He said, 3 years ago." She blinked. "You've been coming here for 3 years." The man didn't answer. He looked down at the headstone. "I didn't know where else to go." He said, "I owed him everything. Couldn't face anyone. But I could come here. I could sit with him." Claire's hands trembled. "Did you serve with him?" He nodded. "Afghanistan. Same unit. I was in the Humvee he pulled me out of. I was unconscious. I didn't even know until after. By the time I came to, he was already gone." The words hit her like a truck. Claire closed her eyes, the ache in her chest pressing harder than it had in years. "I've been trying to piece things together since he died," she whispered. There was never much detail, just that he'd saved someone, that he'd done something heroic. "He did," the man said. "He saved me." He took a breath, shaky and raw. "I came back broken. Couldn't work, couldn't think. Started drinking. Lost everything. But one day, I saw a memorial online. His name. And then I found this town. I've been sleeping rough ever since. But I come here. Every night." Claire stared at him. "You've been guarding my son's grave." He shook his head. "Not guarding. Just keeping him company." Neither spoke for a long time. The snow fell gently around them, piling up on Ethan's grave, dusting the edges of the stone. "Finally," Claire asked, "What's your name?" He hesitated, then said quietly, "Thomas." She nodded slowly. "You should come in from the cold, Thomas. I don't deserve that." "Why not?" He stared at the ground. "Because he's gone. And I'm not." Claire felt tears slip down her cheeks. "That's not your fault. Feels like it." She stepped beside him. "Then, let it feel like something else. Let it feel like a second chance." He turned his head, looked at her for the first time, really looked at her. Her grief, her strength, the kindness in her eyes that had been given year after year, one quilt at a time, without ever asking for a name. The same kindness he had clung to for 6 winters. Thomas nodded once, and for the first time in a long time, he let himself cry. The next morning, Claire found Thomas sitting on her porch swing, just where she'd left him the night before, wrapped in one of her quilts. He looked smaller in the daylight, less mythic than he'd seemed beneath the moonlight, more real and more broken. He didn't say a word as she handed him a mug of coffee, just held it in both hands like it was something precious. Claire sat down beside him, pulling her cardigan tighter. The silence stretched comfortably between them, not awkward, but tentative, like two people learning how to share space after years alone. "I'm sorry I didn't come sooner," she said quietly. Thomas shook his head. "You came. That's enough." They sat in silence for a while, the winter wind whistling softly through the pines lining the backyard. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" she finally asked. "All those winters. You knew who I was. I was the one handing you those quilts. I didn't think I deserved to be seen," he said. "You were grieving. I couldn't walk up and say, 'Hey, your son died saving my life. Mind if I crash in your garage?'" He let out a dry laugh. "I thought just being near him, near you, was the only way I could pay any of it back." Claire's heart squeezed. "That quilt you left, it was the one I gave you last year. I patched it up best I could," he said. Thought maybe he'd want it. Claire closed her eyes, struggling to hold herself together. Every time she thought she'd already cried all her tears for Ethan, a new wave found her. "I used to believe he died for nothing," she whispered. "That it was a waste. A stupid, pointless war." Thomas didn't argue, but after a moment, he said, "He talked about you. A lot. Said you made quilts for everyone. Even his drill sergeant got one." Claire smiled through the tears. "He didn't tell me that. He kept one with him. Said it made him feel like home wasn't so far away." Her breath caught in her throat. Thomas stared down into his mug. "I wasn't worth it," he said. "What he gave up. I've done nothing with it. I just ran. I didn't know how to carry it." "You don't have to carry it alone," Claire said. "Not anymore." That day, she made calls to a friend at the VA hospital, to the community outreach coordinator at the shelter, even to a retired colonel she hadn't spoken to since Ethan's funeral. She didn't know what she was asking for yet. Just that this man, Thomas, needed a hand climbing out of a hole he'd been living in for far too long. But Thomas didn't stay in the house. He asked for the tools in the shed and spent the afternoon fixing the gutter over her back porch. Then he shoveled the walk. Then he chopped the wood she hadn't had the strength to split herself. He moved like a man who needed to earn every square inch of kindness, like if he stopped working, the whole thing might collapse. Claire let him. For now. That night, she brought out old photo albums. She told him stories about Ethan as a boy, about how he insisted on saluting strangers when he was 6 years old, about the time he cried when he saw a hurt pigeon and begged her to build it a bird hospital in their shed. Thomas listened without interrupting, his eyes fixed on the photos. When she got to the one from boot camp graduation, he leaned forward. "I took that," he said. Claire blinked. "What?" "On my phone." "He sent it to you, huh?" "Right. He asked me to snap it just before we loaded the buses." She stared at the picture, suddenly seeing the angle for what it was, not posed, not official, just real. A friend's snapshot. "I was right behind him when it happened." Thomas said, "When the convoy got hit, I remember the fire, the heat. Everything felt like it was slowing down. Then he yanked me backward and pushed me clear." He looked down at his hands. "Next thing I knew, I was in the dust. They said I blacked out. He didn't make it." Claire reached across the table and put her hand over his. He flinched slightly, then let it stay. "You're not the only one who's been carrying this," she said. The next week, Claire helped him file paperwork, reopened old medical records, pushed for evaluations. The process was slow, but she was relentless. Every night, she cooked. Every morning, Thomas fixed something: the leaky faucet, the squeaky porch step, the rusted hinges on the gate. Every evening, they walked to Ethan's grave together. Not in mourning anymore, but in memory. The storm hit hard and fast. By late afternoon, thick sheets of snow blanketed the town. swallowing up the roads and silencing everything. Claire watched from the kitchen window as the wind twisted snow into tight little cyclones across her yard. Thomas was out in the garage, patching an old space heater back to life. She had asked him to stay inside. He hadn't listened. She smiled to herself. He never did anything halfway. That night, Claire sent him home with a thermos of stew and an extra quilt, the one Ethan had taken to boot camp. Thomas insisted on returning to the shelter, said he'd promised someone there a game of chess. She didn't argue, but he never made it there. By morning, her phone was ringing. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. "This is Officer Lane with the West Side Precinct." "Ma'am, do you know a man named Thomas Ray?" Her heart flipped. "Yes." "What happened?" "We found him in Crest Hill Cemetery last night." After hours, there was a report of someone trespassing. Claire's stomach dropped. Trespassing. "Yes, ma'am. He was kneeling at a grave. Wouldn't leave when asked. Said he needed to finish something. Officers detained him for his own safety. We didn't book him, but he's here now. I'm on my way." She drove through the still unplowed streets, her tires slipping over slush, her fingers locked on the wheel like a vice. She didn't even remember getting dressed. All she knew was that Thomas was sitting in a police station, cold and alone, and no one there understood who he was or what he'd done. When she arrived, she stormed past the front desk and straight into the holding area. Thomas was sitting on a bench in a corner, still wrapped in the quilt she'd given him. His face was bruised, his eyes tired. But when he saw her, he stood. "Claire," he said quietly, "you didn't have to come." "Yes, I did," she said, jaw clenched. "What the hell happened?" He looked down. "I just wanted to leave the quilt. For him. For Ethan. I didn't realize the gates had closed." Claire turned to Officer Lane, who was standing nearby. "You detained a homeless veteran visiting a soldier's grave," she said. "His grave. Do you even know who this man is?" The officer looked stunned. "Ma'am, She pulled a photo from her purse, one she carried every day of Ethan in uniform. She held it beside Thomas. "He saved this man's life," she said. "And he's been sitting at my son's grave every night for 3 years, keeping watch. Because that's the kind of man he is." The room went still. Officer Lane cleared his throat, suddenly aware of the weight of it all. "Ma'am, we didn't know." Claire stepped forward. "Now you do." She turned to Thomas, her voice softening. "Come home." He hesitated, then nodded. That night, the news broke. A young journalist, who happened to be at the precinct covering a separate story, had overheard everything and tracked them down for a comment. By morning, the headline was everywhere. "Mother of fallen soldier defends. Homeless veteran who guarded her son's grave for 3 years." The story went viral within hours. Donations poured in, offers of housing, counseling, job placement. A senator's office called. So did a major news network. But Claire turned them all down except one request from a local veteran support group who simply wanted to meet Thomas and say thank you. He agreed. Quietly, reluctantly, but he agreed. The support center was tucked inside a red brick building near the train tracks, barely marked except for a small, hand-painted sign above the door. "Veterans helping veterans." Thomas stood outside it now, the January wind tearing at his coat. He shifted from foot to foot, reluctant, nervous. Claire stood beside him, hands in her pockets, waiting. "You don't have to go in," she said gently. "But they asked for you. That's all. No speeches. Just faces. Just people who know what it means to survive something you weren't supposed to." Thomas stared at the door. "I haven't been around people like that in years. They're not looking for perfect. Just real." He nodded once and stepped through. Inside. It was warm. Loud. Laughter and heavy boots and the clink of coffee mugs. The walls were lined with photos, old unit shots. hand-scrawled thank you notes, medals in dusty display boxes. A group of men and women turned as they entered. Their smiles were immediate. "You must be the one we've heard about," said a woman with a buzz cut and a service dog at her heel. "Thomas," he said, voice gravel low. "Marine," she asked. "Army." 25th Infantry. She nodded. "Iraq, Afghanistan, 2018. Another man stepped forward, gray at the temples, cane in hand. "Moore's unit." Thomas blinked. "Yeah. How'd you know?" The man held out a hand. "Because my nephew was in the one before it. Said there was a kid young, sharp, who ran straight into hell to pull someone out of a burning Humvee." Thomas hesitated, then shook his hand. What followed was simple. Nothing grand. Just conversation, coffee, a chess match, shared war stories, shared silence too. The kind that only people with the same scars know how to sit inside. When it was time to leave, the woman with the dog stopped him. "You ever need a place to land?" she said. "You come here. No questions. We've all been lost. Doesn't mean we stay that way." Claire watched from the doorway, her chest warm in a way it hadn't been since Ethan's last letter. The following weeks moved slowly, but with purpose. Thomas stayed in Claire's guest room, though he still slept most nights on the porch swing, quilt wrapped tight around him. He fixed what was broken in the house without being asked. Not just the obvious stuff, leaky faucets, sagging door frames, but small things, tightening cabinet handles, oiling squeaky hinges, fixing the radio Claire had long forgotten. He left the house every morning before sunrise, returning from the cemetery with frost in his beard and quiet in his eyes. Sometimes Claire would find him sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. Sometimes he'd be reading one of Ethan's books. One morning, she came downstairs to see him standing in front of Ethan's portrait. He wasn't crying, but his hand was resting against the glass, steady, like a soldier on post. Word spread in town. The bakery down the street left out fresh bread just in case. A local barber offered free haircuts. A teacher invited him to speak to her students. He declined, but thanked her. A VA counselor came by once a week. Slowly, Thomas opened up. He filled out paperwork, started the long, grueling process of securing his benefits. Claire sat beside him through it all, guiding him through the maze of red tape like someone who'd spent a lifetime navigating grief and paperwork and silence. And bit by bit, something shifted. Not loudly, not all at once, but slowly. One day, Claire caught Thomas humming while sanding down the back deck. Another day, she found a note on the fridge that read, "Simply made soup. We'll be back by noon." His handwriting was steady, intentional. On the first day of spring, the mayor's office called. They were planning to honor Ethan on Memorial Day, and they wanted to include Thomas in the ceremony. He nearly said no, but Claire just looked at him. He'd want you there. So Thomas said yes, not because he wanted a medal, not because he craved redemption, but because Ethan had never had the chance to accept a moment like that. And Thomas could carry it for him. The Memorial Day ceremony was simple: a podium, a wreath, a folded flag. No parade, no trumpets, just people, veterans, families, a town that hadn't forgotten. Claire sat in the front row, a white rose pinned to her lapel, Ethan's dog tags in her pocket. Beside her stood Thomas, hands clasped in front of him, clean-shaven, dressed in a borrowed suit one size too big, with his boots still scuffed from the cemetery dirt. He hadn't wanted to speak, but the mayor insisted just a few words. He stepped up to the mic, slow and steady. "My name is Thomas Ray," he said. "I served with Private Ethan Moore. He saved my life." A pause. "I lost years running from that, from the guilt, the weight of living when someone else didn't get to." But his mother, he turned slightly, nodding to Claire. "She reminded me that living isn't shame, it's duty. And if we've been given time others never got, we better damn well make it count." The crowd was silent. A few bowed heads. Some tears. "I'm still figuring it out," he said, voice gravel low. "But I'm here. And that's a start." He stepped down. No applause. No fanfare, just quiet respect. The kind that doesn't need noise to be felt. That summer, Claire and Thomas planted a garden behind the house. Nothing fancy, just tomatoes, basil, and 2 rows of sunflowers. The fence Thomas had built around it was perfectly square. The gate creaked just enough to sound like home. In the evenings, they sat on the porch. Sometimes they talked about Ethan. Sometimes they just watched the sky. The town never stopped calling him the man from the graveyard, but now it was said with warmth, with pride. Thomas got his benefits. A small check, health care, the start of a pension. He used some of it to enroll in night classes at the community college. Welding, carpentry. He didn't say why at first, but Claire knew he wanted to build something lasting. One night, she found blueprints on the kitchen table plans for a new veterans shelter. Just a small one. 2 stories, 6 beds, a porch out front. "Think I can pull it off?" he asked. Claire looked at the sketches. Then at the man who'd once slept behind a dumpster with a folded quilt under his head, the same man now drawing futures on napkins and backs of receipts. "I think Ethan would be proud," she said. The following winter, Claire made quilts for the shelter's opening. Each one had a patch stitched with Ethan's name and Thomas's. Because they were no longer separate stories. They were threads in the same fabric, torn, mended, and stitched into something strong enough to keep others warm. And this time, Thomas didn't leave when the first snow came. He stayed, because he had found a place to belong. This story reminds us that kindness doesn't need a name to matter. A simple act, a quilt, a gesture, a moment of compassion can ripple across years, even save a life. It shows us the quiet power of redemption, that healing isn't always loud or immediate, but can begin with being seen, being remembered, being forgiven. Most of all, it teaches us that no one is beyond reach, not the grieving mother, not the lost veteran, not the world-weary man sitting in silence. Sometimes justice comes not through punishment or recognition, but through connection and the chance to begin again. Thank you for being here and experiencing this story with us. Your time and attention mean everything. If this story moved you, inspired you, or gave you something to think about, we invite you to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next powerful moment. We're building a community around stories that matter, stories about humanity, justice, second chances, and everyday heroes. And we want to hear from you. What did this story mean to you? What kinds of stories would you like to see more of? Drop a comment, share your thoughts, and help us shape the content that speaks to your heart.